Hum bum bum ba hum hum ba hum.
Cast.
Oh, there's that rec icon. Mickey hit the button. I now have a fancy new microphone. Hello and welcome to the Humble Ass Godcast. I'm here with our local radiocarbon expert, Mr. Radiocarbon dating expert. He's got an archaeology degree, Mr. Mickey Luberta. And Mr. Scroggins, who I don't know if you have any expertise on today's current topic, but what we're going to see if Scroggins could maybe be converted to Christianity by the Shroud of Turin.
Good luck with that, but okay.
I think some metallurgy does come up when we were discussing the brown corners, but we can keep going.
The metallurgy, right? Yeah.
Ironworks, metallurgy, it'll come into play. You'll see.
Scroggins is an iron worker, and he's also an expert in rocking out to KMFDM.
Will's new favorite band.
Yeah, I don't know about that. Yeah, maybe we'll get some artificial intelligence to make some KMFDM intro or outro music for us.
Well, I think that when the Byzantines were testing the Shroud of Turin for authenticity by striking it with a flaming sword, at least as some people say, they might have been listening to music like MFDM. You know? I think that would be the perfect type of music for that sort of Byzantine purity test.
Oh man, God help us, Lord, Holy Spirit, please guide us in this discussion of the Shroud of Turin. In the name of the Father and Son, and the Holy Spirit. It is strange what humans have done to authenticate the Shroud. I don't think that I've heard that story, Mickey. Well, what was up with that?
So this is the Shroud, which we'll be talking about, and we'll show you guys in a second. It made many journeys and was lost in time for a little bit. But this Russian paper that I was just kind of brushing up on before this ep made the claim that when it was folded, one of the things that they would do to see if it would be destroyed is they would strike it with a hot rod, or at least this is one of the theories. And if it caught up when inflamed, then it was a fraud. But if it withstood the heat, then it was definitely the actual true Shroud. And that is part of what they think might explain some of the burnt brown ends. But there's also many other theories. That's what's great about archaeology. There's a lot of things where there's many viable explanations, but we're not here to explain.
And are we to believe from that theory that the Shroud indeed did not light on fire?
Yep. That is the explanation, and I think the Russian guy might have been a little more of a believer, but I didn't sound biased to me,
Yeah. Well, and maybe we should keep score for the Shroud. Well, we'll put that as 0.1 for the Shroud. But I think that it is a very interesting situation with this. With this garment, this piece of fabric. It's the most famous piece of fabric of all time, and it really highlights. I come from a background of scientists. For all our listeners, side note, I'm a little bit sleep deprived because I've been driving a truck all night, and my speech impediment. I actually prefer stutter to speech impediment, but I always stutter more on the word stutter. It always gets worse when I'm a little bit tired. Anyway,
speech impediment is a really hard word to say for people who have speech impediments.
It's a little bit, but the thing that's really hard for me is the ST sound. Stutter. Yeah, that's rough. But also the word science is always hard for me. I do come from a family of scientists. My dad he actually just retired, but he taught nutritional biochemistry, and his dad was a physicist and worked on the man Manhattan Project and other like weapons systems types of things. So I grew up amongst scientists, and the Shroud of Turin is an interesting object for the scientists, because it very much is an example of it. It seems that the scientists' interpretation of what the shroud is depends on if they think that it is Jesus or it is not Jesus. So the thing about science is we're supposed to be objective, right? Like confirmation bias is a problem for scientists when you just read the results of your data in a way that supports your pre-configured beliefs. So yeah, I think that this Mickey, you had talked about the Shroud of Turin being a Dark Age mystery, and I do think that it is a Dark Age mystery, but I think that the Shroud is very interesting for us in this time in which we live, because the Shroud, in a way, it's like Jesus calling for us to investigate this thing with science, as in the Gospels when doubting Thomas said, I'm not going to believe that Jesus has risen from the dead until I can like poke my finger in his wounds. I'm not going to believe. And then a week later, Jesus shows up and says like, "Oh, okay, Thomas, put your fingers in my side, put your fingers through the holes in my hands." And Jesus does say, "Blessed are you now that you believe, but even more blessed are the people who believed without seeing, who believed without needing to poke their fingers in my side." The Shroud of Turin, I think, in a way, is calling for us to do that, to poke and prod and figure out what's going on. And interestingly, the more our science is able to investigate this thing, the more of a mystery it becomes. Like the closer and closer they do they test it, the more questions people walk away from. And
I was
being
going to say
purposely vague here, because we should go over what the Shroud actually is.
I was going to say, so for some people might not have any idea what it is. First off, Scraga, what is your knowledge here? Why don't you tell us why I pull up the image here?
Oh, well, I mean, it's like, I knew when we started talking about this, because it's, in my religious upbringing, I don't think we spent a lot of time talking about it, but it's like, it was discussed before, where it's, the presumption is that the Shroud of Turin is is the burial cloth of Jesus. So that what the thought is. That's why there's so much fixation on this. Will shared with us a video where they went over some of the research that's been done on this. I'm obviously going to let him kind of get into the details of that, but that is what people claim it to have been, or that are speculating that this is what this is.
Yeah, maybe I can give what I learned from the art historical perspective. And Will, you brought up a hilarious point in our little group chat, that like it's really crazy to think that the Shroud of Jesus Christ is an art piece, but that's sort of where it fit in my high school education or whatever. And I had a really great teacher who was actually really acknowledging that this is a spiritual and valuable like concept, and not just some memento that like what people would go to visit on a pilgrimage or whatever. But yeah, so this is like when someone dies, and this is 2,000 years ago, so an important person dies, they would lacquer up their body with some oil, and that was for preservation and probably some cleanliness or smell or something, and then be wrapped up in what is a linen tapestry type thing in this case. And it's pretty clear, if everyone's looking at the screen right now, that it's a human body with long hair. Now, that's one of the funny things that I never realized, is that a lot of the depictions and, because painting and stuff wasn't really a huge thing back then. No, there's no portraits of Jesus. But this is one of the main reasons I think they have him always depicted with long hair early in the early church mosaics, and then later on in actual paintings and everything. But yeah, the position of his body is all very clear from absorbing it. And it might be odd, and this is what I was sort of referencing, this this KMFDM moment, these like burn marks, if that's what they are, and that's just one theory, is that that's actually where it would have been folded up for storage. And this is, by the way, this is one long extended piece. It's not two different linens. It's actually like would have been folded over. And so that's one of the theories why they get this strange discoloration there, is because it might have been tested with a hot knife or hot sword or hot rod. But there's also other theories that it just simply got some erosion in wherever it was stored, because that's basically the corners of where it was folded over. So I think it looks really heavy metal regardless of these little burn marks or bend marks, whatever you want to call them. So that's how I was presented the actual material explanation. Now the story of its journey and its validation and multiple fires is really where it gets exciting, in my opinion.
Well, yeah, because also the fires, it's survived multiple fires, right? I mean, could it be that the burn marks on the edges are just it was just close to some fire?
Yeah, that's probably the more reasonable explanation. But I liked this Russian speculation, you know.
Nice.
But yeah, I think it's the interesting thing that when I was a little like high school atheist was like, the long hair, that's sick. It was just like, you know, it made sense. And again, I was presented by a very intelligent woman that the whole story of the carbon dating, which I think we'll get into, and why it has reason to be skeptical. But I think there's a lot more of the battle and the debate. And I didn't even know about this $1 million prize thing. So that's the other part of it. But yeah, historically, where this garment was in the early church times, I don't really know, but I think they have records in the 400s and 500s of it showing up in the Byzantine church area in like Anatolia. And then eventually it gets to Italy, where now it is in the city of Turin, why we call it the Shroud of Turin. So I think those are the important historical keynotes. Do you know anything about any of the other mysterious places it pops up, Will? That's all I remember learning about, really.
Yeah, the history of it, or just how we got it now. I think you did a pretty good recap there. It was with the Byzantines for a while, and then there's some story that it was owned by a king who like thought it was precious. I forget how the story goes, but he buried it, I think, or like built it into the wall of a castle, and for hundreds of years it was lost. And then I think that the story is that there was a flood, and the castle flooded, and then from rebuilding from the flood, it was then found again. So there's interesting things like that. And then one thing I think we should make clear here that is we want to get into talking about pretty much what if this is a forgery, and what does that mean, as point one, and then point two is what if it's not? What if it is what it appears to be, and what do we think about that? Well, we acknowledge that we are not experts, and we definitely encourage. What I would hope to do with this podcast is just like ignite people's curiosity in this thing, and there's there's all sorts of things to be found on the internet about this.
One thing I was going to add real quick on just sort of the history, because again, there's a lot of unknowns in this part, but one of the known knowns is the fire of 1532. And I was trying to look up some like hard primary sources on this, and now I realize it might have been my AP art history teacher kind of adding a little fanciful story, but there was a known fire where apparently the roof was burning down, and one of the brave citizens went in and like risked his life to save the shroud. And so that becomes a key factor in some of the validity of the authenticity checks and stuff. But that was always what I thought was one of the cool stories that got me in, of like, and why would I was folding this in my mind as Dark Age Dark Age miracles, but just the miracle of inspiration that people would potentially burn alive to save something is that's actually a recurring theme in the Bible and in Christianity, I think.
Indeed.
But that was always a cool thing. And then eventually, maybe at the end, we'll get into the fire of 1997. There was another time it could have burnt down. And then I think there's been a few other smaller fires. But yeah, this is, the preservation by true believers has never stopped since it theoretically was created in 32 AD or 33 AD, if we want to go with that. So I think that's a really compelling part of the story.
Well, so you all are being I feel like you all as the agnostics on this podcast, if for people who haven't listened to our past podcasts, I am a Catholic. I'm a Catholic convert, and I'm full of zeal and enthusiasm from recent conversion. And you all are you're just a recap. Scroggins used to be a Presbyterian, and then a Pentecostal, and it seems now you're kind of a seeker. And Mickey, you were raised Lutheran, and you're kind of skeptical about some changes that happened in your church, and all these things. And if people want to get our background, they should go back to episode 1. Anyway, I thought that you all, as the kind of non-believer, questioning characters in this podcast, would be more skeptical of the Shroud, and so I do think I think that we should get the skeptic's voice in here. My experience growing up, Mickey, you were in AP art history class.
Let me add a caveat. I think it's likely it would exist. It's true, but my scientific mind definitely doesn't give it 100%. That's definitely the Jesus's body and the oil impression. But I think it's a pretty good chance it could be it.
Well, and also, can I add, Mickey, the thing about the oil, I think that there's that. I've heard.
I got that wrong.
No. There's that they don't. There's this thing that we should get into. There was a study in 1978, and just to add to what you said there, it's not sure that it is oil. But let's
some sort of stains. Yeah, it could have been a decomposing body stain. That might have been what I was learning. Maybe it was. I don't know.
So there's also been studies about that. Let's get into. I'm going to do a recap of just kind of the history of the science. Let me just say though, my experience with the Shroud. I was just in like basic public school history class, I think it was, or maybe it was social studies, and I remember learning it. I don't know. I remember a picture of the Shroud in a textbook, and it looks like a photographic negative, and it's like this is like a ancient picture of Jesus that was taken on a piece of linen, and like the Christians, the Christians believe that this is a picture of Jesus, and I remember it just being like, what, like those wacky Christians, like they'll believe in anything, Yeah. It just seemed kind of silly, and there's a mixture of it with, I think, if you're not steeped in the faith, the violence and brutality of what supposedly, I believe it's true, happened to Jesus. For people who are on the outside of the church, it's just odd. Just even the image of the crucifix. I think you walk into a church and here's a figure of this guy nailed to a cross, and this is God. It's kind of like God is dead, and like there he is. If you don't understand what's going on there, and then of course the Christian story, of course the power of it is Jesus says, I lay down, I have the power to lay down my life, and I have the power to take it up again. So he was he came back to life. But I think it can be off-putting to people on the outside of the church, of what why are we celebrating and telling children about this story of extreme violence, and the markings of that violence are definitely in the shroud. You were going to say something, Mickey?
I was going to make some joke, but no. Before we go to the technicalities, Scrago, are you? It's the real deal. Are you on maybe? What's your stance on the shroud, on its validity?
Yeah, I mean, like, I like. Here's the thing: is it's in terms of being a forgery, I'm not. It could be that, because I'm agnostic on these things right now. I would say I went through a period where I was a very bitter atheist, and now I'm more of the mindset that I just don't know about the existence of God. So, in terms of Jesus Christ dying and being resurrected on the third day, I don't know. I mean, that has to be my position. It's like this happened 2,000 years ago. I think Jesus was real. I think there was a real person. I think that some of the stuff that's like written in the Bible, it's like how do I say this? Like, you take the accounts of the Gospels. I think there was a real person that existed who said probably some stuff that was similar to that stuff, whether it's been corrupted by it being passed down over 2,000 years in different texts and then interpreted by a bunch of different people. I think there was a real person. I think he was crucified.
But do we have his body bag? Is that his real preserved body bag?
Well, but that's the thing too, because it's like the thing is, if we do have his, I mean, I don't know if we have a body, but it's like if we did have a body, that would also mean the stories aren't true, because on the in the biblical account, he is resurrected, he goes around and he sees people, and then he brings the disciples together.
I think Mickey said body bag.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Oh, is it his body bag?
Not body bag, but no,
body
just
bag,
real quick,
right?
Yeah, body bag. But
I don't know.
That's how you could really crudely describe the Shroud of Turin.
I don't know. I mean, here's the other thing: is like my understanding of this from just reading about the stuff. Will sent us a video. It was what is it? Pints with Aquinas. I guess we could like maybe put that in the video description to link to it. But
Totally.
It's like the point they make is that it's I think it's like the real first appearance of this is like in the 1300s. Is that correct?
The first appearance in Europe.
Okay.
Yeah, there's some primary text that, again, that's debatable because it wasn't called the Shroud of Turin when it wasn't in Turin, So
right.
Yeah, but it's real quick before we get into the technicality too. I do want to say, Will, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be the atheist gotcha guy, because that in many ways is what this really embodies, and I think why some of these articles were in like they were in like the Charles Dawkins era in the early 2000s when everyone wanted, being an atheist and one-upping the Christians was just like a normal trending thing. And I think this sort of quest to disprove those silly Christians think they got the real shroud is just one of these tacky, that sort of era of liberal snobbiness. And I'm not going to play any part of that. But I will argue some of the technical reasons why it might be fake. And ultimately, though, it's going to sum up that it doesn't matter if it's true or false. It's what we really believe and how we take away and all the inspiration that comes to me. So, but I think we should debate the true or false. But at the end of the day, it's going to be about how it makes you feel in your heart. And when true believers have exhibited that over many centuries, you think it's got some power. It's a magical thing.
Well, Mickey, I think that was very well said. I do highly disagree with you on your overall point there. I think that it does matter if it's true or false. And I guess I'll say from, I mean, so you're I feel like you're repping the kind of lovey-dovey.
If it makes you feel good, go for it.
Yeah, just whatever makes you feel good. And like for me, I have to say, as a Christian, I came to be a Catholic. We'll do an episode about this someday, but I had a strange and long journey. I very much felt called to the faith and through a series of trials and tribulations. And I came to believe for a variety of personal things that happened in my life, and then very much just I think if God is real, Christianity is what God would look like, in various ways that I could argue. But my point with that I'm making there is that I don't need the shroud to believe in Jesus. I don't need the shroud to believe in God. But the shroud exists, and some people call it the silent gospel. That like if this if this thing is real, then it's there's Jesus. I mean, it's astounding. It's a way for us to kind of look at Jesus and have this document that tells the story of his death. And if it's not real, then to hell with it. And we should. I don't care how it makes people feel. You know, it's either real or it's not real.
I 100% agree with that. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, the Catholics, they love their relics, and this is like the top tier relic, I would say.
Indeed. Yes.
So if we indict this relic, then we indict all relics, right? You know?
Right. Well, yeah, and I think that's a good point, and I think Mickey, there's this thing that people do these days of it's it's very popular in our environment of religious freedom, that it's just like it's all up to you, it's all up to your interpretation, and what that worldview assumes is that there isn't such a thing as the truth.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a lot of the lost faith and I've had in society is this, wavering understanding of truth. But yeah, go ahead, Scott. Go.
But I guess the thing with that is, it's like I think you're kind of, I get it. It's like the idea that there is an objective truth, but I think the situation me and Mickey find ourselves in with relative to this artifact, it's like, like in terms of being like a forgery, I don't know about that, but like, I don't think we actually have enough information to know even what this is. So it's like, to me, it's like, well, could this be the burial cloths of Jesus, that podcast that Will shared, that we'll have linked? One of the things they make a comment about is that there's a certain layer of some kind of a residue that's on it that makes it so that when light hits it a certain way, the image of a man's face becomes visible, but if you look at it from another angle, that's not visible. The image that's there is very lightly, it's not even painted, because painting would be too, any kind of painting that we've known about historically it would penetrate the cloth too deeply for there to be an image visible, and that you could have had this certain conflagration of different substances, and then if it was basically heated to a certain degree, or if like a certain kind of energy dispersal on it happened, then that could lead to this, but less than that wouldn't have led to this image being visible. It's like, okay, look, so there's some arguments for why this could have been the burial cloth of Jesus, and when God, Christ himself basically decided now's the time that I come back to life, and like there's some kind of an energy flow into that which brings life back into the body that he had. That could be the case, but it's like, to me, there's also this thought of it could also just be something entirely different, and we're imposing this image upon this idea upon it because of our Christian faith, where it could be that it's something else entirely. Could have been the aliens using their alien body at some other time that had nothing to do with Christ at all, and we don't even know who that person was. That's my
I think you figured it out. I don't think we need to do this pod. It must have been the aliens.
See, what I want as an archaeologist is what we call experimental archaeology. I want somebody to put a body in a similar shroud for 3 days, and then have it removed immediately, and then sit it in some, like, basically simulate the whole life of the shroud. So in 2,000 years, we could compare that one to the photos we have now to know if it was actually the same type of decomposition, then with the body removed, then because my point I'm trying to make is that there's no other. If this was the case of Jesus's body's like burial shroud, there's no other comparable shrouds that had a body in it for 3 days and then were preserved in dry, weird castles for 1,000 years or 2,000 years.
And you also left up the part where then the power of God brings a dead body back to life. So it's like you have nothing to compare that to because dead people don't come back to life.
No, exactly. So it's a good proposition, and it's almost weird to be scientifically defending it from the Catholic side because it's like it doesn't need science for it to actually work,
Right.
So Mickey, great segue there, and and Scoggins, I think that what Mickey is saying is this like what would it be like if we have an example of a shroud from history of somebody who didn't come back to life, or it just like what can we historically compare this to? And you're right, Mickey. Historically, we don't. I've heard we don't have anything to compare it to, but there have been many attempts to recreate this done recently, and so yeah, let's jump into it. How about I'm going to jump into like a quick just kind of hitting y'all, or I'll try and make this quick, just with the facts, just some things that I've learned.
Yeah, definitely.
So this is we've talked about what does the Shroud of Turin mean, and like let's get into just what is the Shroud of Turin. Well, what does it show us? It's a linen cloth that seems to have an image of a man imprinted on it. We don't know how this image was made. And Mickey, what you brought up about oil, what's odd about the image is it seems to contain 3D information. It's not just a 2D pressing on like a flat surface, or what people have tried to do would be that'd be the same thing as people do the thing where they take a piece of paper and then they like draw with like a crayon over like a gravestone to like get the marking. What is that called? Like a etching. It seems to so pretty much the most similar thing that we have to compare this image to is an image that would have been made with light, like a photograph. So in 1978 there was this study done called the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin research project. I think it's called STERP. And a bunch of scientists were invited to come just do experiments on what the shroud is, and the closer they look, like under microscopic inspection, the more unexplainable the image itself is. It's so thin. The pigment that is making the image is so thin on the linen fibers that it doesn't seem to be burn marks. It doesn't seem to be paint. There's no if it were paint, there would be some sort of angle to the brush strokes. They don't find that, and they're pretty much just like and not again, like I'm not an expert. This is just what I've heard, so I encourage all listeners to go look this up. But they've the closer they look at the image, the less sure they are. Like usually the closer you look, the more you can tell what's going on. But it seems to be a play of light and shadows on a 3D surface is kind of what I understand. I have a background in photography, and there's more that I could say about that, but we can come back to that.
Real quick note, Will, which I was interested in thinking about this. I was never under the impression that the skeptics thought it was painted, but I'm sure some people did. But to me, the most obvious explanation was it was a being literally the devil's advocate here, is it would be some medieval, up and coming, cheater, some miscreant was a grave digger and thought that they could, sell this to the local church as a relic or something like that. That it was actually a body that left an impression, but it wasn't Jesus's body. That's what at least I always thought was a part of the debate. But I could totally see how a full-on forgery would, like a modern day forgery, even like this could have been lost in the 1800s and somebody made up. Then I could see the sort of how people would think it might be like painted or recreated. But yeah, I always assumed if it wasn't Jesus, it was just some other random person from a long time ago.
Nikki, I see your point with that and why that would be logical, but the thing is, then if that was the case, we'd find other shrouds that looked like this, and it would be so common if that was the case that no one would consider, oh, this is the thing that Jesus was buried in. And it's like, no, that's the thing that my cousin Vinny was, buried in, because all of the shrouds and the burial.
There's been grave robbers for thousands of years, though, and maybe one person just was on their regular grave robbing duty, and they came across a weird one. They're like, hey, we could dupe the local church,
And now a quick word from our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by death. The number one cause of life is death. If some things didn't die for us to eat, then we wouldn't be able to live. So we're appreciative of all the things that have died that allow us to live. And also, if you're a believer in Abrahamic religions, if it weren't for death, we would be trapped here in this fallen world. So, you gotta die to get to heaven. To be or not to be? That is the question, and the answer is B. Anyway, back to our fresh and fabulous content.
Or something.
Well, what I'm saying though is it's like if these shrouds were that common, then you wouldn't have a situation like, look,
I don't think they were common. That's what I'm saying, is like somebody was going about their grave robbing and they found something weird, because maybe it was like a 700 AD body that somebody was like, especially buried because they were a local whatever king or something. I'm just trying to say that to play the devil's advocate, there's a rational explanation that some weird preservation happened to some old body and somebody dug it up. Or it could have been very similar to the Jesus scenario where somebody dug up a freshly buried person, stole all their jewelry, and then left the shroud somewhere, and it then was discovered later. That's just, I'm trying to be the most rational person here, and I don't think it's necessary. But
so Mickey, I mean, just to that point, and I think that this is what Scroggins were saying. Like, if that were the case, wouldn't we expect that we would find more of these things?
I mean, that's not always how archaeology works. There are definitely cases where you find a single artifact with no comparable experience, but
okay,
it doesn't happen often, though. I'm just trying to say it's within the realm of possibility, and this is what the rational atheists would want to say.
Okay, so and that's a good. I don't know if I've ever heard that one. That it's not a forgery that was made, but like essentially a forgery that was found and then said to be the body of Jesus, right?
Yeah.
And so Maggie, just with that point, I mean that would that argument would make what I'm about to say not matter. But another interesting thing to point out about the shroud is that it's anatomically perfect. That it's the proportions of the body do look like just the exact proportions of a human body. And we've probably all heard stories of speaking of grave robbers, I'm pretty sure Leonardo da Vinci, there's stories that he would rob graves, right? And I don't know if he would rob graves, but he would dissect bodies to get the proportions perfect. And that was what in the 1600s or something. The point being, if you look, there's an argument out there that the Shroud of Turin, we're going to get into the radiocarbon dating, but it is a forgery from the 1200s. So the idea being that it was painted in some way, and that's just go look at paintings of the 1200s. They didn't have the anatomy of the body right. They weren't going into graves to dissect to get all of the muscle tone and everything, and the shroud is anatomically perfect.
Yeah, and I'm going back to just what my AP art history high school atheist mind was thinking, because we were presented with this, the thing we're going to get into, which is that 3 different sections were dated and they all came up into like within 2 or 3 years of each other. And that my first thought was, oh, that was somebody else that died then. And this was just somebody, and in some ways people thinking it's Jesus, and, and you believe it long enough and it becomes true in their minds. That was what that was my first interpretation. We were never presented the idea that it was painted as a fake.
Okay, so that's good to know. And so yeah, just kind of moving through some other things about the shroud. There is blood on the shroud. There's a lot of blood. There has been debate. There's a guy named Mick Crone who was part of the STIRP study. He argues that it's iron oxide, or that essentially it would be like rust, not blood, but there is a brown, some sort of marking of a brown red pigment that does have the chemical compounds of iron in it, which of course is in blood, and the scientists debate what this is, but let's just assume that it is blood. The blood mark this person, this body was punched in the face. There's blood around his eye. There's blood in his feet. There's a blood marking between, I think it's between the 4th and 5th rib. And there is, and this is an interesting point. You'll see, it's kind of hard to see in the picture, but the guy seems to only have 4 fingers, and the blood marking in his hand is actually in his wrist. And
yeah,
this is a this is his historical fact. We're used to the image that Jesus was crucified through the palms, but actually, if you were to hang somebody by their palms,
it would rip out the hand.
There's no bones between your palm and this and it's all cartilage, so I've heard, so it would just rip through your hand. So they would do it through your wrist, and they would hang you like that, and then of course after the body has gone through rigor mortis, his wrist would have been collapsed like this. It's also interesting to note, I've heard in that video that Scroggins referenced, the Nazis, I think it was, or maybe it was the Japanese. They did experiments on this. That's an excruciating point of pain through the wrist. If you want to torture somebody, that's a good way to do it, because hanging from your wrist there is so much pain. Crazy story. We might get into someday. I once was put in handcuffs, and the handcuffs were slammed down on my wrist so hard that I lost feeling in the bridge of my thumb for like 9 months. That's a story maybe we'll tell someday. So keep listening to the podcast. But anyway, I decided that was just a minor experience that I had of just the pain of that was just unreasonably excruciating. And of course, it's because going into your hand, our hands there are so many neurons in our brains that connect to the hands. There's so many nerves going through your wrists. So anyway, wait, I
was gonna say, I know the tight handcuff feeling. Scroggo, have you ever had the tight handcuffs?
Yeah, I've had them on me too.
I figured so.
Oh wow, okay. I didn't know we've all had that experience. Yeah. Anyway, so and then the body does the body's head seems to be down like this, and his knees are raised up and his feet are clapped like that. Point being, it's a body that and then the idea is that his hands would have been up like this, and then they forced his hands down like that. But so it does seem to be a body that was crucified, and then went into rigor mortis. So his head is down as one would be, and his knees, you know, his feet were nailed to the cross. So his knees are bent, and then
Well,
you know, it just.
Well, I was going to say real quick, all these details are so specific. It almost seems too good to be true. Now I'm kind of leaning back towards the painting side.
I know.
Yeah,
Okay, point being, just for anybody who's not familiar with the Bible, those. Oh, and another thing that I have to point out in terms of blood, his scalp has deep puncture marks in it, and guys, can I just get through this real quick just to get this
Well, I
done?
just want to
it.
zoom in on something that goes with your side. Okay, I think Mickey already sees it. If you look at the back of the shroud, where the crown of thorns would have been on Jesus, if you look at the back of the head, you see a lot of blood stains like there that, you know, go with what Will was saying at the top of the back of his head, and I guess on the front too. And then if you look down at the right above the ankle where the crucifixion would have been, you know, they would cross the legs and then drive the nail through the like just between the you have the split in the bones in the lower leg. That is like the shin and the other, like the tibia, I can't remember. But if you look at the back, kind of right above the ankle, you can also see something that if there would have been a spike driven through that, you can actually see something that looks like a hole, like a blood stain that would have been a result of that. Go ahead, Will. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and then I'll just add to that for anybody who is listening to this podcast and not watching, we don't require that you watch the podcast, and then we invite you in your free time to just Google a picture of the Shroud of Turin, because you can see all these things. And Scoggins, just to add to what you were saying, we think these days that the crown of thorns would have just wrapped around, you know, his scalp, like as the brim of a hat would be, but probably more what it was like a bush of thorns that some soldier just like crammed onto his head, and the puncture marks do look like they went through the scalp to the bone of the scalp. So it was and I forget, in that video they talk about it was some sort of thorn bush that had really intense thorns. It probably would have been dried out and almost as hard as nails. Final thing that I'll bring up is there's scourge marks all over the body, and it looks like so what scourging was, for anybody who's not familiar. And this is the type of stuff, guys, I have to say, when we start talking about this stuff, I mean, I have to be careful not to start crying because it just is so horrible. If anybody so I mean, it's, you know, either this is a forgery or some human being did go through this, and whether we even think that it's Jesus or not. But for anybody who has seen the Mel Gibson film Passion of the Christ, Mel Gibson has said he did over exaggerate in that movie for dramatic effect. If somebody was scourged to the extent that Jesus was in that movie, it would have killed him quickly. But what the Shroud of Turin does show us, Mel Gibson, what he shows is whips that were covered in seashells to rip the body open. What the Romans actually used, and I forget exactly the technical term, but it was a three-pointed whip, like a whip with three ends on the end of it, and there were lead balls tied or somehow connected in to the end of the whip. So this it would be what Mel Gibson shows is kind of the flesh being ripped. What the Romans actually did, it was kind of like a blunt trauma whip, and it would hit you so hard that it would leave marks, and these marks are kind of as bad as a third degree burn would be. So it's kind of like, you know, when you if anybody's ever had a blood blister, like you get blunt trauma so hard that then it becomes a blister. And this man has been whipped, he's been flogged 120 times. And Jewish.
Well, just again, this very specific number, that's not archaeology to me.
Look it up. No.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay,
archaeologists would never, like, they would say 100 to 140 or something.
Okay, so Mickey, I encourage you now. I mean, for anybody who's watching this, Google Shroud of Turin scourge marks. I don't think that there's any. I don't think that there's debate about this. You can count because it's a three. They
maybe
can tell that it was. They can tell that he was whipped by two people, and they can tell the height of both people from the angle of the whip. I mean, this is just so I've heard. Let's just Google. I mean, like that's.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's no expertise on. There's no people that are experts on body impressions from 3 days in a 2,000-year-old linnet. Like I don't know how anybody would be so assertive that that's 100% what happened. You know.
Well, so
that doesn't sound scientific to me. You know.
If you look up, okay, I mean, if you Google the scourge marks, they've counted these things out, and the thing is that it's like blisters, and like Mickey, that's a good point. I mean, like how do we know this? And I guess I would encourage. This is the point. The point of this podcast is I feel like everybody should look this stuff up. Like it's just so I should say, Mickey, my inclination is to argue with you, because for me, I'm a very empathetic person, and I just start to think about what this must have been like. So Mickey, maybe you're right. Maybe we should encourage people to do their own research. So Mickey, let's just assume that what you're saying is true, that it's not 120 times, it's 100 to 120 times. In Jewish law, you were not allowed to flog someone more than 39 times. And
right.
This is part of the story of Jesus. One of the mysteries is, why was he flogged? If you read the gospel accounts, Pontius Pilate is the Roman guy who interviews him, and Pontius Pilate says, I find no fault in this man. It's actually interesting. He asked Jesus, what is truth? And Jesus says something like, I'm telling the truth. And Pontius Pilate says, well, what is truth? So he's kind of a symbol of relativism. So Pontius Pilate doesn't think that Jesus should be crucified. So he has Jesus flogged and then dressed up as like a false as a king to mock him, and the crown of thorns as a way to humiliate him. And it doesn't say this specifically in the Gospels, but I think it's a pretty clear in interpretation that Pontius Pilate does this because he doesn't want Jesus to be crucified. He thinks this guy, he's accused of claiming that he's God. So if we flog him and claiming to be a king, if we flog him and dress him up like a king, then people will be like, oh, okay, he's clearly not a god and he's not king because he wouldn't allow this to be done to him. So it was not common for everyday criminals to be flogged and have a crown of thorns put on them and then crucified. It was common for people to survive on the cross for days on end. And so one thing that's strange is that in the story of Jesus, he dies in a rather short time frame. So we can understand that he was probably, if we believe the gospel accounts to be true, beaten so severely that he died from being beaten and then crucified. So that's just I get off. I'm trying to just talk about the facts of what we see in the Shroud of Turin, but it tells this story of somebody who has gone through just a horrific, a really bad day, and what we see in the Shroud of Turin corresponds to the wounds of Jesus in the gospel accounts. So it either seems to be what it says it was, or it's a forgery. So maybe we can get into that next.
Yeah, no, and I think the forgery in this case could also apply to somebody in the 12th century who went through that exact same torture in a torture chamber at the bottom of a castle, and then somebody found it 100 years later and said, "Hey, there's a lot of money to make on relics." Like there's still a rational explanation that all that could be true, Will, and it just wasn't specifically Jesus's body. Now, again, I think what we really should get into is the nitpicky scientific nerds who want to make everything wrong, make everything that like makes believers happy wrong, and then also, like again, with a function of it, whether it does, the debate we were having earlier, like how much, if it is real or not, matters in how we navigate our belief and appreciation of God, and through these relics that, again, the Catholics love, but the Protestants, we poo-poo those things, So I don't. That's all. It's a very interesting perspective to me on that. But I mean, yeah, going into what we were really going to talk about again is why people think the forgery might have happened is because of this carbon dating effort. Was that the early 90s or was that the 70s one? Didn't they do this twice, Will? You want to maybe get into those science nerds?
So 1978 was the scientific study of the shroud, which was just involved like chemistry and whatnot. And then in 1988, so 10 years later, they did the radiocarbon dating. Before we get into that real quick, because that'll be our next topic. Scroggins, did you have something to add?
Keep going.
Okay, I thought you said. Okay, so yeah, let's get into the radiocarbon dating thing. Yeah, in 1988. Mickey, it seems I've talked a lot. It seems like you generally know about that stuff. Would you want to tell us about the radiocarbon dating? Yeah.
Yeah, and Scroggins, are you familiar with this at all? Of what they did?
I might have heard briefly about it. Like,
okay.
I'm being honest. Like, this is when I was Christian, it's like I knew some things about the Shroud of Turin, but it was like literally. I mean, look, I it's like I had an hour or two of like Bible class every day for like 6 years growing up in my junior high and high school. This got mentioned like one time.
Yeah. No, so this science angle probably wasn't presented. So what I was just going to preface that with is I'd like to hear your direct feedback if this makes you more or less believe. Well, what side are we putting the tally mark? But so I guess 88 they cut off a little corner.
And it's important that it was a corner. Okay, yeah.
This is very true. A little corner that probably would have been exposed to other things more than the center, and they cut it into 3 pieces and sent it to 3 labs, 3 separate carbon dating labs. Now, quick rundown. I think you know what carbon dating is. Maybe some of our listeners don't, but it's a very simple process of when an organic material. So in this case, this would have been some plant that was cut to make into linen. When it stops living, so a living organism that's based on carbon has a steady balance of carbon-12 to carbon-14 ratio. And once it stops living, make sure I get this right, the carbon-12 starts decaying, or maybe it's the carbon-14 starts decaying because it's more unstable, and it slowly becomes more carbon-12. So by analyzing the ratio of how much carbon-14 to carbon-12, and then based on what we know the natural ratio would have been in the year it came about, and there's a lot of tables out there because we've had a lot of evidence to show what the natural carbon balance is for that time. Because it does vary, like when there's ice ages, it changes, there's different stuff that affects what the balance is. But we do have a lookup basically. So when they go and take these tests, they're able to determine how many years of decomposition of this balanced, carbon happens. Now, what was a little, startling, I guess you could say, is that all 3 labs came up with like, what was it, 1152, 1252? I forget what the exact year was. It was sometime in the medieval times. So now, when you do carbon dating, for something 800 years old or 2,000 years old, you have a variance. You do it if you measure it a few times, you're probably going to get a few different dates. Within whatever a margin of error. So the fact that this came in within like 18 months, all 3 of these were like within a year or 2 of each other, was a pretty clear sign that corner of the shroud was from that time. if
and Mickey,
you
can I just
understand, if you think that was just taking the simple sample, an unaffected sample. That's what I was going to say.
And Mickey, can I just say, and then this just gets out into how just like the science is just all up to our interpretation, which is not how science should be. So I've heard something different than that. I've heard that the three labs all said different dates, and it was like a hundreds of years gap
This is an important
between
one.
the dates.
I'll do a little fact check on this, but
just as you're doing that, Mickey, just for the listeners, these dates were in, as Mickey said, the like 11 to 1200s.
Oh,
so
you are totally right, Will. I was misremembering this. What was I thinking about? But yeah, they aged it 1260 to 1390. So within 130 years there.
But like point being, more than 1,000 years after Christ, so like more closer to our time now than to the time of Jesus, which would of course imply that that this was not an authentic piece of linen. And interestingly,
I was just going to say, I'm looking at the name of this is pretty funny. So they called it the 1986 Turin Protocol, which was the protocol to make sure it was a fair and blind scientific test. And then later on, they had the 88 Final Protocol. It's like, I don't think you should use Final Protocol too often.
The Final Protocol.
We have the final solution on the Shroud of
Turin. We've figured it out. The Christians are actually boobs. So Mickey, can I just add to what you're saying there? What's also important about that date, so I've heard, is that's right around the time that the Shroud was first like found, first surfaced in Europe.
So
that
probably on the other side a little bit, you know.
Yeah. Okay. I'll mark that one down for like point one for the point for the skeptics there.
Yeah. So the story either way, so the science, I guess, came back. But then this is the key thing about how carbon dating works, is that the balance of carbon is supposed to be preserved. So in archaeology, when it's buried 5 feet underground for 1,000 years, sunlight, nothing is affecting that decomposing piece of organic matter. But when it's carried around or put into castle walls, exposed to floods might not affect it, but exposed to fire. Now that is a key thing that will adjust the carbon balance of a decomposing organic material. And so to me, it's very simple to explain that all the times it got shuffled around, and then when it was saved in the fire of 1532, that's sort of the dramatic element that comes into this carbon dating, debate, is that, it was maybe even the faith of the believers that ended up creating it as this, the dinosaur to tempt you. It's like the faith undid what could have been a great piece of evidence, but again, that's what's interesting. And then again, going into the history, so 97, here's one quick Mickey hot take before we go into more debate. So 97, there was another fire in the actual modern place it's stored. And so after that fire, there's no way that carbon dating would ever be accurate. So did the priests create that fire
really?
to create a little cover story? So that's like, well, we're never going to have this dating debate again because now it just got another little smoke damage.
So I didn't know that. I hadn't heard that aspect. So Mickey,
that's just my hot take. I came up just right now, so I don't know.
As our radiocarbon expert here, why would a fire ruin? Is it because of the smoke of the fire?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's just it's making the process of decomposition of that carbon 14 to carbon 12, change, and it's like,
and why does heat increase that?
Yeah, I'm not a chemist, so I don't know that part. Yeah.
But the point being like that's like a smoke screen, literally and figuratively. And Mickey,
was it a delivered smoke screen? I don't think so.
Can I just add to what you were I'm saying there? I mean, and this is now I'm back in the camp of thinking that the radiocarbon dating was was not very good science. So the thing is, the place that they took the sample from, in order to do this radiocarbon dating, they had to cut part of the shroud off of the shroud, and this is like the most valuable and sacred garment
church was not going easy on that one
in history. So it was a big concession for the church to make on that front. And by the way, it's actually the church doesn't own the shroud, and the church, the Catholic Church has not come out and said we think that the Shroud of Turin is real or not. They don't have anything to say on this. So it's the royalty of Turin, Italy. So I've heard who on this.
It's a gamble from the church's perspective too, and that's an interesting way to think about it. It's like, do they date it and gain new followers because it hits right at the time it makes sense, or do they create more skeptics?
And I see what you're saying, Mickey. And what you're saying about the fire would also add to. But can I just finish my point there? That when they cut the sample off of the shroud, they cut it from a corner of the shroud. So for thousands of years of history, if you were going to take the shroud out, and this is medieval people before modern museum techniques of preserving things, if you take out a piece of garment or fabric, where are you going to hold it? You're going to hold it at the corners. So it's quite likely that the corners would have decayed, and there's this thing called an invisible French weave, where people can repair fabric by going in and actually weaving fibers back into the fabric. So it could be that where they took this sample from was actually from the 12 to 1300s, but it was a repair of the original shroud.
Yeah, and that would be, I think they could probably test that, because there's I actually had a professor, or she was kind of the hot PhD that was running on the dig we were doing, and she her whole thing was like tapestry woven thing, and there's a huge history of people doing microscopic analyses of all the different ways you can not only spin the thread but then weave the thread. And I don't know enough about it actually, but there's a lot of scenarios though that and that it was exposed to things that would have changed the preservation. Now, final just archaeological point though, linen does not preserve well, so this would have been a lot of believers knowing that they have a secret relic, preserving it in like a stone dry space or something, or it could have been something, but we do have linens from the medieval times that preserve well. You don't find many from the Roman era that are still sticking around. So that in itself is kind of a miracle. So Scroggins, on the carbon dating, are you more or less of the Shroud is true believer?
I honestly kind of zoned out for a bit of that because it was just a little too technical for me. And I mean, I got what you guys were saying, but I kind of, I'm still of the mindset that I just don't know. It's like, that's the thing. It's like you said, there is like a part of this that this is preserved, as long as it has been from like the Roman era, like that this is still around. There's something semi-miraculous about that podcast that Will shared. He's talked about some of the details from that where we don't understand how the markings on this have preserved and why it looks the way that it does, that there's not really a strong explanation as to why this thing has the properties that it does. There's something that's going on. I don't think people, here's my thing. I don't think that people from 1200 tried to create something to look like the burial cloth of Jesus, to silence the skeptics because you just got killed if you were a skeptic back then, basically. Because there's no such thing as I mean, at that point in Europe, it's like, oh, I'm not a Christian. It's like, oh, are you a Jew? We might beat the shit out of you. Or you're a Muslim, in which case, get the fuck out, kind of thing.
You're right. I just was on Wiki real quick, just to throw this out there. I think you mentioned it earlier in some terms, Will, but there is a huge scientific movement to try to prove that there was a corona event, a corona discharge, which is a like nuclear radioactive thing that can be like a phenomenon that might have happened at the moment of resurrection. So people have also tried to look at how the rules of plasma, which only exists in space, and how it could have been a plasma like event that has created a unique, an unprecedented like mark on this linen. So
the funny thing is you saying that, I do know that there have been events where like you've had like a coronal discharge or whatever from the sun, where things on Earth just spontaneously burst into fire because of all of the energy that was ejected from the sun. Like, and I think there was even like an event in like the early 1900s. We don't talk about it, but there's records of this. So yeah, I mean, maybe there's something like that, and maybe that is like the power of God impressing these events to. I mean, obviously, it's like, I'm an agnostic, so it's like I view God's existence as kind of a Schrodinger's cat situation. It's like there's a box, and something we know there's a cat in there. Is it dead or is it alive? So to me, God exists. He does this. He wants a record of like what he did, and that he did actually the events of the Bible being as they're interpreted, that they are correct. It's a possibility, but I'm not swayed into the God doesn't exist, God does exist camp, or that the Christian narrative is true in its theological sense or not. So
okay, but if we're using Schrodinger's cat like a quantum physics example, isn't what we learned from quantum physics that the mindset of the experimenters can determine the experiment? So if you've got an option of God is in the box and he's either dead or alive, like Schrodinger's cat, wouldn't you agree, Scroggins, that it would be better for there to be a God rather than not be a God? And in that case, why not? If your mindset can determine the result of the experiment, why not just believe in God? It's like a pass.
Okay, well, if you really want to go down that, so here's my thing. So we're now assuming the Bible's true. In the Old Testament, when Israel is before they made it to the land that they claim for their own, the Jews, there's a point where basically, and I'm bastardizing this, is not like obviously literal language, but basically the Jews weren't worshiping God correctly, so he killed all of the adults, and then basically started over. You also have that. It's like, if that's the case, the Jews have historically been God's people, and then he obviously just said fuck y'all in the 1930s in Germany. Now the thing is that it's like he's God. God makes what is right correct. He defines morals because he's the most powerful being that is. So it's like, okay. Also, there's in the New Testament talking about Christians, there's people according to Christ who cast out demons in his name and performed miracles, and then on the day of judgment he will say, depart from me, for I never knew you. It's like, is it just better that God does exist? It's like, I don't know that it is, because it's like you have a ultimately powerful being that can basically shape all of existence in reality with thought, and I don't know that that's a good case, because it's like, it's more comforting to me that I die and don't exist than that I die and burn in a fiery hell of misery that I can't even conceive of in this life for an unending amount of time. Forgiveness. So that's my thing. Is like you're saying is it's like whatever. When I said that, I wasn't talking about God existing. I'm talking about whether the shroud is the burial cloth of Jesus or not. Because it's like, to me, it's like I'm not swayed one way or the other. Something's going on, but I just also don't know. The other thing is that even if we talk about the bloodstains being on there, there's iron present, which obviously is part of like human blood. It's not like we have Jesus's DNA to be able to like compare it against. Be like, oh, well, this was him. Like, we don't even have that. So
what about Da Vinci Code, though?
Well, and actually, interesting, y'all. In Scroggins, that was very well said, and point well taken. I just point your point about the blackness. No, it's more comforting that after death to just not exist at all, be in a oblivion, like a sleepless dream, than the potential of going to hell. I would just point out that is as much a matter of faith as there not being a heaven or a hell. We don't know if there's if what happens at after death. There is actually a lot of reports of out of body experiences and the people seeing the tunnel of white light. But I just make this point here.
Go back to the Shroud of Turin real quick.
Okay, but I'm just saying that choosing to not know, choosing agnosticism, it seems comfortable to just not know. But that is as much a choice as trying to know. And I point out in Revelations, if we do believe in God, God says, I will spit you out if you're lukewarm. So God would prefer people to be hot or cold rather than lukewarm, rather than just saying like, I don't know,
Well, but I mean, like you're assuming that that's what the case is, and then to me, it's Well, here's the other thing with this: is it's like I didn't want to do this. Like to me, the value of this podcast is to look at the value of religion, because to me, whether God exists or not, it's so like you believe in God, so you look at the Shroud of Turin and you're like, that's the burial cloth of Jesus. There's all this evidence that says that that's 100% is the case. Now, Mickey doesn't look at it that way. He's open to the idea, but he doesn't say 100% this is one way. He has skepticism. I think we both yield that there's something interesting going on with the Shroud of Turin, but it's like I said the thing about the aliens. The point is also, it's like it could have been a coronal mass ejection from that time period. Look, Jesus is not the only person who got crucified in the Roman world. He's not the only person who received political punishment and received a brutal punishment as a result of that. So it's just as likely that this could have been someone else. Having beards back then was probably more common than not.
Well, I was going to maybe just reword. I love what you said, or your question to Matt. I was like, why wouldn't it be better if it is real? So I kind of wanted to flip this on you and like, isn't the worst case scenario that everyone believes it is very real, but then it is proven that it's not? And so isn't that sort of like why the church maybe, walked on eggshells and maybe got a little egg on their face in this situation, was because this whole point of the value of a relic, and again, this is the top tier relic, really. This is also the evidence of the sacrifice, of the passion of the Christ itself, put into, every depiction. And it's like, if that has to be put on trial for true or false, wasn't that in some ways a misstep, because it's creating this unknownness, of whether it's true or not?
So, and that's a great point, Mickey. For me, what I like about this is I feel like God is so good at doing this. I feel like it's flipped around, and what is on trial now is actually our faith in science. Because from what Scroggins said there, I think ultimately it doesn't we just went through all of this science, and Scroggins, I don't mean to take a shot at you. I totally feel this. You said that you zoned out. I feel that actually what is revealed in all this is that science is just this very elaborate smokescreen for people to pretty much just decide what is the most comfortable thing for them to believe. So either if it's comforting for you to believe in Jesus and believe that you're going to heaven, or I think the modern comforting thing to believe is just that that life doesn't matter. Everything is meaningless. It's just a bunch of chaos. So we just, it just doesn't really matter what you do. And we've gone through all of this science, and ultimately it doesn't change anything. It ultimately is just what you choose to believe in. And for me, it's just like that was the footing that the faith was on before we even talked about the Shroud of Turin. The science has looked at the Shroud, and from my estimation, the closer science looks at the Shroud, the less questions are answered, and the more questions that there are. So the faith remains standing just where it was, and it's science that's kind of knocked off its rocker by this.
All right. Well, real quick counterclaim, but I want to hear both your feedback. So what if this is simply just a learning moment of not relying on physical evidence for your religion to function? Like that this is a spiritual philosophy, and not if the Pope says that's the actual Shroud, then we got to believe it. And if we don't, we're out of the church. Like that us versus them, and relying on something physical and tangible is a failing of a modern religion and church. That would be my impression.
But there's no church that is saying that. There's no one saying that
that's the
you
implication.
have to believe in the Shroud of Turin.
No, but I mean that's the implication.
He's saying a hypothetical.
Of its like there are probably every Italian that lives in Turin that's very Catholic probably has a religious miracle moment when they get close to it. I don't even know I don't think that you can actually see it. I don't know where it is, but knowing that it exists is a miracle to them. But is that actually going to be a long-term functional way to connect with people about religion? I don't think so.
Well, also, Bill, something with that is it's like you even referenced Thomas where he talked about, Christ, he had to put his fingers in and all that, but Christ says it's better to have faith without having to have these things. So, I mean, maybe it's better in that scenario to have faith with never in Christ without ever reading about Christ and not knowing any of these things to even be true. If that's really the case, and we're taking that principle to its kind of logical end. And my thing is this is you believe this stuff very strongly. And I'll be honest too. I'm fine talking about the Shroud and doing this, but I think when we started this podcast, what I said is I'm an agnostic. I see a lot of value in particularly the Abrahamic religions. So Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, I'm putting them all under the same umbrella because I think also you see a prophecy that's come true through that because Elohim said to Abraham that I will make your descendants as numerous as the seas. And at this point, between Christianity and Islam, which all basically spring forth from Judaism, you have the majority of people on earth in one of those two faiths. I don't bring up Judaism just because they are, relatively speaking, a small number compared to the others, but they all have the same root of that Abrahamic faith. So from that sense, I mean, and that was written thousands of years ago, and today in the modern world, that is a fact. Does God exist? I don't know. And it's I don't really want to do a podcast where we talk about this because I think ultimately, Will, to you, this is a sign that all of these things are true. But you actually a priori, before even kind of getting into the Shroud, I mean, getting into this discussion about it and looking at this information, you're going to see a bunch of stuff that confirms what you believe. For me and Mickey, it's an interesting thing to talk about. And there's some very interesting questions that are a result of looking at this. But I can't speak to Mickey, but for myself personally, I'm okay, it could be this. It could be something else. It could be a thing entirely that we don't even have any idea about. But there is this interesting artifact that does seem like it kind of gives validity to the Christian religious faith. And I don't know. Here's the other thing with you guys. If you want to be entirely honest, Christ I think it's in one of the Gospels. They
I was
talk.
just going to say, there's a lot of ways. Oh, this is backwards. This is my archaeology Bible that has all the footnotes of all the archaeological digs that are relevant to each of these moments. It is really awesome to think about hard evidence when it comes to the Bible and religion. But
Right.
yeah, I think I agree with Scroggins that we should maybe go one meta level step up and discuss how these different belief systems function and how maybe. Again, I think this is an interesting story going back to what you're saying, Will, of like the movement in the 70s, 80s, and 90s of the science atheist to disprove, this well-beloved Catholic, relic, and why that doesn't actually win any hearts over anymore. And that I think in the 2020s, we're now trending away again from, what I was calling the Richard Dawkins, being an atheist is cool and smart phase. And now we're getting into a time when we should be able to think about it relatively. And I think you could even engage like the new neo-trad, the young kids, with this idea that it is really cool that we might have the body bag of Jesus Christ. And it might not be true, but if we want to believe it's true, because that's a spiritual, awesome experience. And then going back to what I was saying, the awesome stories of people saving it from fires throughout history, that it's just a good narrative that actually functions to make people believe. And then going back to what I was saying, I don't know if it really matters if it is actually the Shroud or not. It's how people have valued it over the centuries.
So, and yeah, I think that this is, I think that
we're approaching 90 minutes, guys. So maybe we should move to wrapping up.
I do need to get to work.
I'm moving towards that. I think that what's interesting is after this whole discussion, it seems that we have not changed our positions, but we are seeing how we all think more. Mickey, I just there's something for me, and this is part of. So I've never been able to understand what the word believe means very much. I don't, and I've always associated it with Mickey, kind of with what you just said there, just kind of something that you tell yourself to give you a warm and fuzzy feeling. And for me, that was always frustrating because I know that it's I know that it's fake. My story that I've told you all, and I might have said this on the podcast, is that when I was about 3 or 4 years old, my sister, who's 3 years older than me, said I don't believe in God, and I went and told on her to my parents. So Haley said that she didn't believe in God, and my parents' reaction was just well, that's her choice. In America, that's we all just get to make our choice, whatever gives us the warm and fuzzy feeling. And for me, at that moment, I was like, oh, well, so Jesus and Santa are just the same thing. What for me is so for me, the word belief, there's a line in the book of Romans, I think Paul says, faith comes from hearing, and hearing comes from the word of God. So something like that. And I really like this idea of faith as hearing, that faith is a constant conversation that I am having with a living person who is both a person, but a far more intelligent. I don't have words for, in the book of Isaiah, he says, my thoughts are not your thoughts. He is both a person that I have a relationship with, but also a much what is the word? Just a much grander and more astounding, an extra dimensional being to who I am. And it's a thing that I am having a relation, I'm having a conversation with it every day of my life. And in order to do that, I have to believe that it's true, that it's real. In the same way that even though I'm sitting here, that my dog would look at me and see me talking to an object, I believe that I'm talking to my friends Scroggins and Mickey. I believe this could be a solipsistic world, and my senses might be lying to me, and I might be a brain and of that, and you all might just be figments of my imagination. But I trust that you're real. Wouldn't it be annoying to you all if I'm just I just believe that you all are real because it gives me a warm and fuzzy feeling. Wouldn't that be And you're like, really, it's just the Truman Show. Really, this is all about me. But I just like talking to you all because of the feeling that it gives me. Wouldn't that be like kind of degrading and insulting?
But Will, I can hug you when I see you. You know? I can't hug God.
But you could hug the Shroud of Turin.
Well, but I mean, Will, you're saying that it's like, I mean, okay, let's just run that scenario. Like, I'm in the Matrix where I'm like, actually, like my body's somewhere else, and this is all a dream, essentially, and it's like a totally simulated world. And you're like, well, you're just doing things. It's like, okay, assuming that is the case, okay, that's what we are. Let's say you guys are both a figment of my imagination, which or like some, machines trying to tell me I have friends, okay, and it's just like, okay, I could spend all my, and I don't think that's the case, but I could spend all my time being like,
So
how do I get out of this scenario where I'm in this thing and whatever? And by the way, I have no way of really reason to think that this is the case. Okay, how do I get out of that situation? And it's like, okay, but you're only having a good feeling about this. It's like, let's take my scenario where I say I'm agnostic because it's like, this whole Shroud thing has got me thinking about stuff. Well, don't think that I'm going to become a Christian tomorrow and like believe in God, because it's like,
Roger that.
Yeah, I don't want to, like, here's the other thing. I don't really want to do a podcast where we just kind of like, God is real, God is not real. I don't think that's interesting to me personally, because I see value.
But Scroggins kind of did, and I do.
Let me get to the end of my point.
Sorry. Yes.
Okay. So, in terms of like, okay, I'm doing this. I'm gonna die eventually. Go into the void. I had these conversations about this, and I enjoyed my time here. It's like, if that's all the time I have, because when I was like very seriously Christian, there was a lot of it that was tied up in misery. Like, being happy and feeling good actually has value to me, because I didn't have that for a long time. So it's like, well, does it just feel bad if it's like, aren't you annoyed that it wasn't this? It's like, given finite time, like, doing things that I think are enjoyable with that finite time actually have lots of value for me personally. And other people may not appreciate that in the same way, but to me, it means something.
And you think that God, if you believe in God, God is telling you that you can't have a good time.
You don't need to.
Is that or Scroggins, when you say that when you were Christian, you were miserable? Well, why is that?
Because, well, I mean, I think part of this is tied up into some stuff with the way my parents parented, which I don't think they were trying to do anything bad or malicious. It's just there was this extent to which what I wanted was of no value. Because it's like, I am supposed to be, I mean, technically, like in one of the epistles, Paul talks about being a slave to Christ. Now, the problem is that we think about slavery in modern America in terms of chattel slavery, which is not what the Bible's talking about when it talks about slavery, or chattel, excuse me, whatever. You're right.
I'm not even sure on that one.
But the thing is you're talking about more of a bondservant. So you have a debt to someone. You have a debt to Christ if you're a Christian, because he died for your sins. And so you are required as an act of faith to do certain things. And it's like, this is probably debatable, but like the idea of like not having premarital sex, which I'm not even sure really how much the Bible even says don't have premarital sex. But it's like, I'm not married. I've fucked a few times, and I think I have a lot of bizarre sexual hangups as a result of like the Christian upbringing I had. Now, you could say that that's not what Christ's idea for my life was, but I have a lot of trauma related to stuff with that. And I'm a bit happier with myself being outside of the church from that perspective. But that being said, I'm doing this podcast because I think a lot of things within Christianity, like our culture, would be better if like they were on board with it. For example, I think repentance, which most people don't even know what that actually is and what it's saying. They don't know what the word means. I think if people took a relative sense where they applied repentance within their own moral codes, I think, and like questioned themselves a bit more, I think you'd have a healthier society. And that doesn't have to be based on a like necessarily Christian religious like viewpoint.
Couldn't agree more, Scroggins. I was going to say repentance requires humility, and humility is not an easy thing to learn. But I do think we need to wrap up. I'm going to go.
No.
Soon. Can I end on a fun hypothetical, or do you want one final response, Will?
Okay, I've got two final responses, but
Mickey,
can I just
do
say
your thing and then go to Will.
Real quick, because I'm gonna have two things, but like, can I just say, Scroggins, and to our viewers, we did just go like launch off into a totally abstract conversation about faith, and I think that is the value of the Shroud. Isn't it cool that there's this piece of linen that just led to this like high conversation of metaphysics?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point of the value, and I think hopefully everybody had some sort of thought in their head. But yeah, so for the Goddess Humble Cast podcast, sorry, I screwed that up. Humble as
Godcast, yeah.
Let's take you back to the year 1999. A young Matthew Scroggins is in the Deep South. He's been identified as KMFDM listener number 74. The team swoops in, and they've picked him up and brought him to the Troubled Youth Center, as his parents were told. He went down to the basement. He got set up on the machine. His new life began in the internet. His first task, become a Pentecostal preacher. Thus, the experiments began.
And we're all a part of your imagination, Scroggins.
Yes, this is all you. You are the center.
We're just artificial intelligence.
The start of it all.
Artificial intelligence on your cell phone.
All right, but yeah, guys, this was a great time.
Wait, okay, so can I just end on this? Just like for me as a Christian, and like annoyingly taking the last word here, I feel like the burden of proof is on science to disprove, to because I mean, as Christians, we don't need. I think that the Shroud, if it's real, mainly what it makes you want to do is just cry, and it does help. I mean, it's a weird thing that God expresses His love for, but by dying for us. But that is it's the most, Jesus says the greatest form of love is to lay down your life for your friends, and Jesus just wants to be our friend, and so for me it's not a source of faith. It just heightens the faith. It just makes the faith more visceral. So I would just say that I think that the burden of proof is still on science to disprove the Shroud. And let's just end on this. So one last test that I just want to talk about, or two things. There was a vacuum test done of the Shroud where they vacuumed up some of the particles that was on it. There was pollen found on the Shroud, like pollen from plants that only comes from plants that bloom in the Middle East in the springtime. That to me, that for me is one of the most like wow in terms of science. Like, what do we think of that? And the last thing that I'll say is there is the argument that the Shroud is a hoax. A problem with that argument is no one has been able to recreate the hoax. And this is we have all of the tools now. We have lasers. We have photocopy machines. We have artificial intelligence. No one has been able to recreate a hoax that is supposed to come from the backwards Middle Ages. And there is now there's a guy named what is his name? I think it's David Wolf or David Rolfe. If somebody Googles this, I thought I wrote it. Yeah, David Rolfe has done a challenge now. There is a $1 million reward for anybody who can recreate the forgery of the Shroud of Turin. So maybe this isn't fair. Okay,
we're not hoaxers. We don't believe
the burden of proof is on science.
All right.
That's
one final thought that just hearing that just made me think a very obvious, unfortunate explanation about the pollen. This was the time of the Crusades, Will. people were like, "Oh shit, we're losing Jerusalem. Let me snag a body and say,
And just
maybe I'll bring this
sprinkle
home."
some pollen on it. Okay.
Well, I'm just trying to say it could have been there's a lot of ways that people were moving things around. But yeah, I gotta go. I really want to swim before the sun goes down. So.
I feel that. I might do the same thing.